Hey, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Les Lenkowsky, Dr. Leslie Lenkowsky, Professor Emeritus at the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. Um, Les, I wanted to talk to you about the most recent Giving USA 2024 report. And then we'll talk about a couple of other things related to current affairs in philanthropy as we have time. But this report from the Giving Institute has been coming out for a long time. I know you've been a part of it. You play a big role in it. Uh, um, so I want to call out some themes that I saw in the most recent report that really stood out to me, and then ask you what else stands out to you. So we'll talk about each of these three things in turn, if you don't mind. Um, the first is continued the second year of decline in overall charitable giving, and when you adjust for inflation. So we now have a 2-year decline. I want to talk to you about that. The second thing is continued shift in the share of charitable giving coming from individuals and foundations, with individuals declining and foundations increasing. And the third, continued, and this is a long-term trend at this point, away from giving to the category that Giving USA calls religion. So does that sound all right?
Sounds great. Let me just say, while I have certainly worked with the Giving USA team for a long, long time, actually am not part of it. And
Right.
whatever I say today is going to reflect my views, not the views of my colleagues who do the research and prepare the report for the Giving Institute.
Very good. Very good. Disclaimer has been entered into the record.
My colleagues would shoot me if I didn't, but anyway.
Yeah, I totally understand. I probably should give some sort of similar disclaimer for myself. So giving, yeah, down when you adjust for inflation, total giving from 2021 to 2023 down 10.3%. That seems like a lot.
It is a lot. In fact, in 2022, the previous year, giving declined more in inflation adjusted terms than it had since the 1950s on a year-to-year
Mm.
basis. But I do want to qualify that a bit. It's kind of a glass half full, half empty. In 2023, giving increased in current dollars and the decline in inflation adjusted dollars was far less than it had been in 2022. In other words,
Yes.
things were getting better. There's a
Mm.
very simple reason for that. Uh, Inflation in 2023, depending on whose measures you use, was around 4%. It was probably twice that in 2022. So as
Mhm.
we reduce inflation, we see those numbers that reflected in giving. Inflation also operates on disposable income. We have a measure in Giving USA of individual giving as a percentage of disposable income, that is,
Mhm.
household income after you pay taxes. And it went down last year from 2% to 1.9%.
Mhm.
And I think that reflects the effects of inflation. After all, your
Right.
household income pays the increased price of groceries, rent, and so on, and there's less left over to give to charity. So
Mhm.
inflation is pernicious. There's no question about it. It is very bad for charity. It also increases the costs for a lot of charities.
Right.
Charities are consumers too. They have to pay salaries, they have to buy goods, and so on. So there's a double whammy at work, and we have been feeling that. The single best way to get giving going again is to put an end to inflation.
To your point, even in current dollars, so not adjusted for inflation, from 21 to 22, we saw a drop in charitable giving. So that was really a big drop because not adjusted for inflation of 1.1%. Last year, 22 to 23, we saw an increase again in non-adjusted dollars of
Right.
1.1%. It just couldn't keep up, didn't keep up with inflation. Uh, the other thing that comes to mind, though, Les, I'll put one more negative thing into the record here. I think the last time we saw a 2-year decline in inflation-adjusted giving like this, I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, anything kind of like it was back at the Great Recession, that 2008, 2009, 2010, um, time period, but then the stock market went down as well. Stock market
That's
didn't.
exactly right. In the Great
Yeah.
Recession, we saw a real decline in income and wealth. We
Mhm.
haven't seen that. In fact, just the opposite. As you know, the stock market's going up.
Yeah.
That partly is an answer to your second question about the shift toward foundation giving. Foundations
Mhm.
giving by law is closely related to the returns they get on their endowments. Those have been going up. So
Right.
this time, however, we do have inflation. And again, it's not just a matter of deflating the dollar by some statistic. Inflation has real consequences. It leaves you less money to give to charity. You may think twice before buying a raffle ticket. You may think again before going to the bake sale. Inflation really cuts across virtually everything and doesn't have any offsetting effects. It just has to end, or else charitable giving will remain laggard.
Right. Well, to your point, again, about we get to the second point now, this big theme I think that comes out of the Giving USA data, this shift in the share of giving, more of it coming from foundations, less of it coming from individuals. If you look at the other categories, they're kind of stable over time, or more or less compared to these two categories. So I calculated this looking at the data. Giving by individuals in real dollars, inflation adjusted dollars, has increased by 135% since 1983. Giving by foundations has increased by 1,040% since 1983. Does this speak to sort of rising just disparity between the mega rich and the rest of us in America? Would that be a reasonable interpretation of
Well,
that?
we certainly had growth of enormous fortunes. In 1983, no one would have heard of Bill Gates, for example,
Mhm.
um, or Mark Zuckerberg. So that has undoubtedly been a case. We become a wealthier country, and all of us have benefited as a result of that. And certainly, when I first became involved in philanthropy in the late 1970s, there were, I think, two or three foundations with $1 billion of assets or more. Ford, the Lilly Endowment, and the new kid on the block, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Today, Jeremy, if you took that 1 billion you've got hidden under your mattress and put it in a foundation endowment, you wouldn't even get to the top 100 in terms of assets.
Wow, is that
We've,
true?
yes, we've had this enormous explosion. My favorite story, mostly because they're our hometown foundation in Indiana, is the
Mhm.
Lilly Endowment.
Mm.
This year, the Lilly Endowment's payout rate, its payout will exceed, not the rate, the actual payout will exceed $2 billion. Next year, it's likely to exceed 3 billion. How come? The result of obesity.
Mm.
Why?
Right.
Because the bulk of the Lilly Endowment's assets is in the stock of Eli Lilly Company. And the Eli Lilly Company has been one of those that has been selling a product for weight loss.
Right.
It also has pretty far along in the pipeline a product to help people with early stage Alzheimer's. That'll be a big seller. So as these products have come on, the foundations that own shares in the companies that make these products have benefited too. Now, having said that, I think it's also important to remember that most foundations aren't anywhere close to $1 billion in assets. We have, but roughly, there's no clear, agreed upon estimate, but let's say there are about 100,000 foundations in the United States right now. Ones with very sizable endowments are probably no more than about 1 to 2% of them.
Mhm.
Many people have created foundations for a variety of purposes as a way of maybe preserving family unity across generations, as a vehicle to do certain sorts of givings. But they are small. They really are as close to individual giving as if the money was coming out of their own checkbooks. And indeed, there are people who have foundations as well as continue to give for certain purposes through their checkbooks. Then the other big story, and part of it is reflected
Right.
in our donor advised funds.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, I don't see any estimate from Giving USA about how much of this, of foundation giving is from DAFs. I would really wanna know that number.
Well,
Perfect
you can
advice.
find that out on the 990s, and I know
Yeah,
my colleagues have been talking about what they should do about this. I'm not sure why they haven't moved on this. There may be a separate report that comes out of the
okay.
Giving Institute on that. But a lot of the sponsors of DAFs are community foundations, like
Mhm.
the Silicon Valley Foundation, and it will be reflected in those foundation numbers that you're looking at.
When it's really a kind of individual giving
It
would
is really a kind of individual giving.
yeah.
I'm not quite sure how they categorize something, say, like the Fidelity Charitable Trust. It
Yeah,
might be under foundations,
yeah.
or it might be with the United Ways, which they categorize as public benefit or something like
Ah,
that.
yeah, I
So it's
don't know either.
probably spread out.
I assumed it was foundations. That would be something to find out, but that
Well, yeah, it may or may, I would have to get into deep into the numbers with my colleagues. They could answer, and I should say for your audience that my experience is my colleagues at the Lilly Family School are glad to answer. A woman named Anna Pruitt is the editor, and if anybody has specific questions, I'd be glad to relay them to.
I'll put, Les's contact information in the, transcript of this interview when we post it on at Philanthropy Daily. That's great. One of the, I think, effects regardless, I think we see a shift toward more a higher share of charitable giving is coming from institutions than from
Right.
individuals. I think even when you were to sort of correct for DAFs, um, one of the consequences might be, this shift away from giving to what Giving USA calls religion. The Lilly Endowment, by the way, I should point out, is one of the only exceptions to this. They actually do give a
Exactly.
lot to religion.
That's right.
Most foundations, the vast majority of the really big ones we're talking about, don't. And so that it's partly, although only partly, what might be behind this statistic from Giving USA. Back in 1984 to 1988, a rolling 5-year average, giving to religious organizations constituted 57% of all charitable giving. In 2019 to 2023, the most recent 5-year span, it was 26%. So that is a decline. It's more than halved since 40 years ago, basically 1935, 40 years ago, 1984 to 88. That's a really stunning shift in charitable giving in America.
It certainly is, but there are a few explanations for it. The big one, which is a troubling one, is that we are less religious. I think everybody knows the numbers. Americans are either leaving religious affiliations entirely or going less frequently. That has a very substantial effect on giving. But in addition, it may very well, it is likely that while foundations aren't giving to religion, with some notable exceptions like Lilly, uh, people sometimes are confused a little bit and think because a foundation is a tax exempt organization, somehow the Constitution applies. So when they give to religion, they will often do it out of their own personal funds
Mhm,
rather than out of
mhm,
institutional funds. Um, it's also the case, though, that other areas have grown, what I like to call quasi-religious areas like
mhm,
environmentalism
mhm.
and
Yeah,
so on.
yeah.
So people are leaving traditional religions. We know this. This has a serious and long-term effect on American giving, and you're seeing it in the share of giving. But it's also the case that other areas are growing rapidly, and so we're talking at relative amounts. I think if you
Yeah.
looked at the absolute amounts, even after adjusting for inflation, there's still a lot of money going into religion in the United States.
And it's true, I should point out too, that many of the organizations that are not categorized under religion by Giving USA have a faith-based component in the arts, culture, and humanities, public society, human services, education, those get categorized differently. I guess in the end, we'll be able to tell, it seems to me, Les. We know the stats are very clear at this point that people who are not only affiliated with a religious congregation, but who attend services regularly, give a lot more. According to Lilly Family
Yes,
Philanthropy's own data, a
that is
lot more
right.
than those who don't, maybe as much as twice as much per year on average. I guess we'll see if that effect should start to show up in the share of disposable income given away to charity over time, right? Like that
Yeah.
should continue to go down if in fact people continue to become less religious.
Right. Another factor that often gets overlooked here, we're all aware that our country is now has many more immigrants. I think the
Mhm.
percentage of immigrants in the United States, I don't want to get into debate on the policy
Sure,
issues,
sure.
but the percentage of immigrants in the United States is greater than at any time since the
Mm,
beginning of the 20th century. Well, many of these immigrants are coming from cultures which don't have much history of giving. They
right.
may have low incomes themselves, at
Yes.
least initially.
That's a good
Now,
point.
again, an open question is as they stay here, assuming they do,
Mhm.
and as they become more American, they absorb our traditions of giving. That
Right.
certainly happened in the 19th century
Mhm.
and early 20th century. Will it happen with the new immigrants of today? Uh, we don't know, to
Right.
be sure, but of course, one big difference is today's new immigrants are coming into a country where a large share of public services are provided by government.
Yeah.
The
Yep.
older immigrants came into a country where you really had to band together to provide a lot of services, and
Correct.
so they did. So this is a very interesting, and while in some sense it's an academic question, it's also a very practical one. And for people who work for charities or who assist charities through fundraising and so on, it's important to figure out ways of reaching out, especially if you live in a part of the country with a sizable immigrant population, to reaching out to these new Americans and getting them to see the value of giving and volunteering, even when we have so many services being provided by government.
That's a really good point. I actually had not thought about the effect of increased immigration potentially on charitable practices and habits. Um,
Well, and one other point I'd make, which may segue us into another topic of
yeah, please
discussion,
do. Yeah.
is we hear a lot about childless families and childless couples, especially
Recently, yes.
in recent days. Well, one of the things we know is people who have children are more likely to give than
Yep,
people who don't.
that's true.
I used to say that, well, when somebody is the group between say 18 and 24, we know their volunteering and giving rates are pretty low. from 24 to 29. They're building their careers and so on. Giving and volunteering pick up when people get into their 30s and they have families, they
Yeah.
have homes, they have communities.
Yep.
Um, well,
Next year.
we're going to have a smaller proportion of people who meet those characteristic if current demographic trends
Right.
hold, and that'll affect giving.
Another reason, just another reason to worry. Well, as I say, you say that's a bit of a segue to a topic we wanted to touch on because it is in the news. You mentioned earlier that the number of foundations with $1 billion or more in assets has gone from just two or three when you started your career in philanthropy to over 100 now, and that has fed in to some uh, fears that there is foundations and other institutions of large endowments have too much power and influence. And JD Vance has been one of the uh, people in public life who has addressed this issue and spoken about potentially making changes to the way endowments are handled legally or taxed. What have you heard about, or what's your thought about that? What he has said, or what people are scared about in the philanthropy establishment with respect to all that?
Well, the good news is Senator Vance is taking philanthropy very seriously, more seriously than probably any other senator, with the
Hmm.
possible exception of Iowa's Chuck Grassley. He has talked about, I'm not sure he's put it into legislation
Hmm.
yet, raising the payout rate, the annual amount to be distributed by big foundations from the current 5% to something closer to 20%.
Mm.
He's also raised something that will come up in the next Congress when we revisit the Tax Act of 2017, increasing the tax on very large endowment. It's currently a little bit more than 1%. I believe he would like to raise it to over 10%. Both of these, neither of these proposals has much support in Congress. Both raise uh, important questions. For example, donors who give to university endowments don't expect their gifts to be subject to tax.
Hmm.
Um, Payout rates, even raising it that high, the returns on investments may not make much difference in asset accumulation. And in any case, if you don't like what the Ford Foundation is doing today, as Mr. Senator Vance does not, having them do it at a rate of 20% a year doesn't strike me as a particularly good idea. But anyway, I think it would be very good to reconsider these rules related to endowments and
Yeah.
giving that frankly have not had a serious reconsideration for close to 60 years.
I agree, Les. If nothing else, reopening this conversation, there's nothing sort of magical or set in constitutional stone with regard to a 5% payout rate and other tax rates. So I really welcome a sort of a candid conversation about these things and to think through what the consequences might be, not just for whatever JD Vance might want, but what might be good for what would be best for the common good. It would be
And
having the
especially
old conversation.
how do we underpin what has been a very important tradition in American
Exactly.
life of giving, volunteering,
Yeah.
community-based help? We've moved a long way from that, and we need to rediscover it.
As we approach America's 250th birthday in 2026, that's a message I've been sorry to put out there that what really has made America great or made America exceptional is its robust, independent civil society, associational, mutual aid tradition. And
Yep,
whatever we can do to underpin and strengthen that seems to me would be very much worthwhile.
I agree completely.
Dr. Les Lenkowsky, thank you so much for
My pleasure.
having this conversation with me today. Take care.
Thank you.